The smell of burning incense floated through the air, heavy and sweet like honey left too long in the sun. It clung to her hair, to her skin, to the thin linen that barely covered her chest. The temple walls glowed with the light of 100 oil lamps, their flame shivering in the warm Roman night. Outside, the city roared with laughter, people drinking, shouting, singing to the gods. But inside these walls, everything was still. The girl stood barefoot on the marble floor. She was 10 years old, too small for the gold chains that now hung from her neck, too young to understand why everyone called her pure. Her dark hair had been oiled and braided. The scent of rose and smoke filled her nose until she felt dizzy. A crown of white ribbons lay against her forehead. Her hands trembled as she tried not to move. A row of men in long robes watched from the shadows. Their faces were pale, their eyes bright with something she didn't yet have words for: pride, fear, or hunger. Behind them stood the Pontifex Maximus, the highest priest in Rome. His voice, when it came, was deep and slow, echoing against the stone. "Tonight you are chosen by Vesta," he said. "You are not a child. You are sacred fire. What happens here is not sin. It is the most holy act that keeps Rome alive." The girl swallowed hard. The lamps flickered. Somewhere behind her, she heard the faint hiss of the sacred flame burning in its bronze bowl. The fire that was never allowed to die. Her mother had told her stories about that fire. It was said that if it went out, Rome itself would fall. But her mother wasn't here now. Her family had been sent away after the ceremony in the Forum. She had watched them vanish into the crowd while the priests led her up the temple steps. She wanted to call for them, but her throat was dry. The air inside the temple was thick with oil and smoke. Every surface seemed to shine: the gold bowls, the polished floor, even the sweat on her own skin. The chanting began softly, a low hum that came from the priests kneeling near the altar. It rose and fell like the sound of the sea. The girl tried to follow the words, but they were in Latin she barely understood. She only caught pieces: puritas, flamma, vita, purity, flame, life. Her knees hurt. She didn't know how long she had been standing there. When she shifted, one of the attendants hissed and pressed a finger to his lips. She froze again. The Pontifex moved closer. His robe brushed the floor as he walked. In his hands he carried a small bronze bowl filled with water from a sacred spring. He dipped his fingers and traced a circle on her forehead. The water was cold. Then he touched her lips. The smell of metal, like blood, filled her mouth. "Do not speak," he said softly. "Your voice belongs to the goddess now." The girl tried to breathe, but her chest felt tight. She thought of her mother's arms, of her father's voice calling her name that morning. She thought of the games she had played in the courtyard, running, laughing, her feet dusty, her hair loose. Now the world felt far away, locked behind stone walls and golden doors. Outside a horn sounded. The crowd cheered. It was the festival of Vestalia, a time when the people of Rome brought gifts to the temple. Cakes, flowers, and coins were laid before the goddess to thank her for keeping their hearths burning. But the people never saw what happened inside the inner chamber. They only saw the smiling faces of the priestesses, girls like her dressed in white, heads bowed, hands folded. The Pontifex raised his hand. The chanting stopped. He turned toward the sacred fire. For a moment the girl thought he was praying. But then he looked back at her, his eyes dark and steady. "Do you understand your duty?" he asked. She didn't answer. Her lips were trembling. She didn't know what words were safe to say. "From this day," he continued, "you will guard the flame. You will live here. You will not see your family again. You will not touch a man. You will not speak unless told to. You will be clean in body and in soul. Rome depends on you." She wanted to run, but her feet felt heavy, as if the marble had turned to chains. The Pontifex smiled faintly, almost kindly. He placed a hand on her shoulder. It was warm and strong, too strong. "Tonight, you become the vessel of Vesta. Rome breathes through you." The torches flickered again. A gust of wind from the open doorway made the sacred flame shudder. Every priest in the room gasped. The girl looked at the fire, afraid it might go out, afraid of what would happen if it did. Then the doors closed. The sound of the crowd vanished. Only the low crackle of fire remained. She didn't know it yet, but her life, her real life, had ended the moment the Pontifex called her name. From now on, she would not be a daughter or a friend. She would be a symbol, a tool, a body wrapped in ritual. And one day, if she failed, that same fire she now guarded would become her punishment. The priests began to move again. The bronze bowl was taken away. The lights dimmed. Somewhere deep in the temple, a door opened with a groan. She could smell fresh oil, hear whispers she couldn't understand. The pontifex turned once more. His face was calm, almost peaceful. The gold around his neck gleamed in the light of the sacred flame. "Tonight," he said again, "you are the goddess. What happens here is not sin. It is the most sacred act that keeps Rome alive." And with that, he lifted his hand toward the inner chamber, the place where no outsider ever entered, the place where truth and power were one. The girl took a step forward, her bare feet cold against the marble. The air grew thicker, the light dimmer. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The scent of smoke and oil wrapped around her like a veil. Then the heavy doors closed behind her. The sound was final, like stone sealing a tomb. Before that little girl ever stepped inside the temple, Rome had already decided her fate. The system that ruled her life was older than her family, older than the emperor, older even than the great city itself. It was built on one idea, that Rome's safety depended on the purity of a few chosen girls. If they stayed pure, Rome would stand forever. If they failed, the empire would fall. It sounds like a story, a myth told by firelight, but to the Romans, it was law. The goddess Vesta was the heart of Rome. Her fire burned in a round temple near the Forum. That fire never went out. It was the symbol of Rome's spirit, living, breathing, eternal. And it was tended only by 6 priestesses, the Vestal Virgins. Each one had been chosen as a child. Each one had to serve for 30 years. 10 years of learning, 10 years of service, 10 years of teaching. Then, and only then, they could leave. But by that time, most didn't know how to live outside those walls. Inside the temple, everything was ritual. They rose before dawn to feed the sacred flame. They prayed, cleaned the shrine, and guarded relics said to hold the power of the city. Their meals were silent. Their beds were simple. Their bodies were not their own. To the people, the Vestals were holy. Crowds bowed when they passed. If a Vestal walked by a man on his way to execution, his sentence could be forgiven because her presence was seen as divine mercy. Even the highest generals stepped aside when they saw her white veil. But beneath that purity, there was control. The Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest, ruled over them completely. He could command, punish, or even kill them. He spoke in the name of the gods, and no one dared to question him. In public, he said he was their guardian. In private, he was their judge, and Rome loved the system. It showed that their empire was favored by the gods. It made people believe that everything, even cruelty, was sacred if done for Rome's glory. The Vestals lived like queens inside their prison. They had slaves, jewels, chariots, and seats of honor at festivals. People thought they were lucky, but that luxury was a mask, because one mistake, even one rumor, could destroy them. If the sacred fire went out, the Pontifex said it meant one of the Vestals had sinned. If a man even looked too long at one of them, she could be accused of impurity. And impurity had one punishment: death. But Rome was careful about how it killed its goddesses. They could not be executed like common people. Their blood could not be spilled because their blood was holy. So the system found another way. They called it the living tomb. A small underground chamber was dug outside the city walls. Inside were a couch, a lamp, a little food, and a jug of water. The condemned Vestal was led there, her mouth gagged so no one could hear her cry. Then the entrance was sealed. The city returned to silence. The people said the goddess herself would decide if she lived or died. But everyone knew what really happened in the dark. The Pontifex Maximus was the hand of that system. He controlled the fire, the rules, and the punishments. He stood between the gods and the people, and he made sure everyone feared him. Even the emperors bowed to his word. Because as long as the flame burned, the city believed the gods were pleased. And as long as the people believed, the rulers stayed powerful. That was the secret of Rome. Faith mixed with fear. It was a perfect trap. A girl became a symbol, the symbol became a law, and the law became untouchable. Sometimes, even when no Vestal had done anything wrong, the pontifex would invent a sin. Maybe the city had suffered a bad harvest, a plague, or a lost battle. Someone had to be blamed, someone had to be sacrificed. So he would call one of the Vestals, question her, and accuse her. The people watched, terrified but silent. They believed the punishment would heal the land. They believed pain could please the gods. And when the pontifex spoke, everyone listened. No senator, no general, no emperor dared to say no. That's how Rome worked, by turning belief into obedience. You see, the Vestal system was not only about purity, it was about control. The idea that some people were above human rules. The priests could do anything, take, command, destroy, and call it divine. And the people accepted it. That's how cruelty hides, behind gold, behind ritual, behind sacred words. Subscribe now, the narrator's voice cuts through, because this will change how you see history. Comment what you know. Watch till the end for real names and proof. Now imagine the power of that belief, an empire built on the silence of girls who could never speak for themselves. They were called holy. They were praised in public, but their lives were ruled by fear. Fear of failure, fear of impurity, fear of being buried alive for a crime they didn't commit. The pontifex said the goddess demanded it, but in truth, it was men who demanded it. Men who wore gold rings and carried staffs, men who said they served heaven while serving their own power. And the worst part? The people believed them. They cheered the festivals, threw flowers at the Vestal's feet, and never questioned the screams they never heard. That's how systems like this survive, not because they're fair, but because they are beautiful on the outside. Gold covers blood, prayers cover pain, and silence covers everything. Now that you understand the system, you can see why the girl in Chapter 1 had no choice. She was chosen, yes, but she was chosen by a machine built to use her body as proof of Rome's purity. And that machine ran on fear. Every smile she showed in public was trained. Every step she took was watched. Every mistake could be death. But how did these girls learn to become symbols? How were they trained to bury their fear, their voices, their own desires? Before the punishments came, before the living tomb, there was preparation. The rituals of obedience began early, and for many that training was worse than death. The girl who had once run through the dusty streets of Rome now moved silently through the marble halls of the temple. Her feet were bare, her hair was braided and oiled, her eyes were wide, drinking in every shadow, every flicker of torchlight. She was no longer a child of her family, she was a child of Rome and of Vesta. The training began immediately. At first it was subtle. A hand on her shoulder, a whispered instruction, a pause when she wanted to speak. She learned to obey without question, to bow without thinking, to smile without joy. Her world shrank to the size of the temple. The outer streets, the marketplace, the laughter of friends, all vanished. The only sound was the sacred flame, crackling and alive. Every day was a test. The Pontifex Maximus would inspect her, his eyes searching for hesitation, for fear, for defiance. If she flinched, a sharp word cut through the quiet halls. If she faltered in ritual, a ritualized punishment followed, symbolic, orchestrated, deliberate. Pain was precise, meant to remind her that her body was no longer her own, and her obedience was the key to the city's life. There were lessons in herbs, in dances, in chants. Each movement, each prayer, each gesture was taught to serve the goddess perfectly. Mistakes were not tolerated. The consequences were not cruel for cruelty's sake. They were cruelty for power, for control, for Rome itself. At puberty, the training intensified. The girls were no longer children in the eyes of the temple. They were vessels, sacred and untouchable, yet entirely subject to the system. They learned restraint, how to suppress fear, how to hide tears, how to speak only when permitted. Every emotion was measured against duty. Every instinct was weighed against ritual, and then came the initiation. It was always the same. The girl was isolated, the sacred spaces closed, the lamps dimmed. She was presented with choices, obedience or shame, silence or death. The Pontifex and his attendants watched every reaction. The ritual was not merely punishment. It was transformation. The girl was stripped of her previous identity. Her childhood, her family, her freedom, all disappeared like smoke from the sacred flame. She became something else, a symbol, a guardian, a vessel. Her body was sacred. Her voice was sacred. And yet, she was completely controlled. The system was cruel in a way that was almost invisible. No one saw the tears she could not cry. No one heard the scream she could not make. Her life became a cycle of honor and fear. The path of a Vestal virgin followed a strict pattern, offer, chosen as a child. Her family wept but could do nothing. Training, years of obedience, ritual practice, and discipline in the temple. Initiation, the transformation into a sacred figure, symbolically broken and rebuilt to serve the goddess. Service, decades of guarding the flame, performing rituals and teaching new Vestals. Decline, after 30 years, a rare few left the temple. Most had been defined entirely by it. Punishment. For the few who failed, the consequences were absolute. A living tomb, silence, and isolation. Every step was designed to erase the self. Every lesson was designed to instill obedience. Every punishment was designed to reinforce the system. The girls who survived initiation were honored, admired, even envied. The city celebrated them. The priests praised them. But the truth was hidden. The cost of survival was the cost of childhood itself. Even those who excelled never forgot the terror of training. They remembered the sharp look of the pontifex, the cold marble beneath their feet, the endless chanting that seemed to echo inside their skulls. They remembered being alone in the dark, learning that their body was not theirs, that their voice was not theirs, that their life had been claimed by the city before they could claim it themselves. And when a girl failed, when her fear broke through, when her body trembled, when her ritual faltered, the system did not hesitate. The punishment was methodical. The pontifex ensured that it was executed with precision, to mark the sacred order, to warn the others, and to maintain the illusion of holiness. The training, the discipline, the initiation, all of it prepared them for a life in which they were untouchable. Untouchably pure, yet completely powerless. They were both above human rules and completely trapped by them. The city of Rome thrived because of this. The people believed the fire would never die, the gods would never abandon them, and the empire would endure forever. And the girls, the Vestals, were the invisible engine of that belief. But remember this, every Vestal had once been a child like her, a child who played in the streets, a child who laughed, a child who dreamed of family, friends, and freedom. All of that vanished when she stepped across the threshold of the temple, and that is why the human cost of the Vestal system was more than life or death. It was the cost of innocence. It was the cost of voice. It was the cost of self. The next chapter will show how Rome's rulers and elite citizens participated in these rituals, the festivals, the ceremonies, and the private gatherings that mixed public devotion with secret power. Rome celebrated its gods loudly. The streets were filled with music, dancers, and the smell of roasting meat. People threw flowers and coins at the temples. They cheered the priests, the generals, the senators, and they whispered prayers for the Vestal virgins, symbols of purity and divine protection. But behind the laughter and the gold, the elites of Rome held a secret. The festivals, the processions, the public joy, all of it hid something darker. The Pontifex Maximus and the ruling class had access to the inner sanctum, the rooms where the Vestals lived and the sacred fire burned. No ordinary citizen ever saw these chambers, and no ordinary citizen knew what occurred there. It was a world of ritual, yes, but also of power and privilege. The same men who commanded legions, collected taxes, and dictated laws also held influence over the lives of these girls. They participated in ceremonies that were public acts of devotion, but they also took part in private rituals, symbolic unions, and performances meant to display control over sacred life itself. The festivals were elaborate. The Vestals led processions through the city, carrying sacred objects, chanting hymns, and sprinkling water from holy springs. The public saw only the purity, the devotion, the glittering white robes. But the elites saw obedience, fear, and absolute control. Some historical records mention real figures like Pontifex Maximus Numa and senators of Rome who were present at these events. They were witnesses and participants, carefully following tradition, yet wielding personal power through their proximity to the sacred. The Pontifex Maximus had authority over the Vestal's training, initiation, and punishment. But the ruling class reinforced that authority. They legitimized it with laws, with ceremonies, with appearances of divine will. And they participated in the festivals, the public joy masking private domination. It was a paradox. The city adored the Vestals, but the elites controlled them. The priestesses were both honored and trapped. They were praised as divine, yet powerless against those who called themselves protectors of the gods. During festivals, the rituals often involved symbolic acts of union with the sacred. Dances, chants, offerings, and gestures meant to represent life, fertility, and divine power. The Vestals performed flawlessly, knowing their mistakes could bring punishment not only on themselves, but potentially on the city itself. For the elite, this was a demonstration of their reach. They could watch, command, and enforce obedience. They could witness the transformation of a child into a symbol of Rome's power, and they could remind the population that even the holiest women were under the control of the men who ran the empire. Some private accounts, historical fragments, and fictional reconstructions hint at the chilling nature of these secret rituals. Inside the temple, doors closed, lamps dimmed, and the girls were led through ceremonies that tested obedience, endurance, and submission. The elites observed from shadowed corners, their presence a reminder that power extended beyond the Senate or the Forum. Everything had layers, public devotion above, secret control below. The festivals themselves were a performance for both city and elite. To the people, music, flowers, and blessing. To the rulers, a controlled environment where fear and devotion intersected. The Vestals were a living testament that sacred authority and human power could coexist or collide. Some Vestals later wrote, or were reported to have remembered, the feeling of walking through these ceremonies, the eyes of the elite upon them, the whispers of approval or warning, the sense that their obedience was not just expected, but demanded, the knowledge that one misstep could destroy a life or a city in the eyes of the gods. The same elites who celebrated Rome in the Forum also dictated the private fates of these young women. They maintained the system by observing it, participating in it, and reinforcing its rules. Their authority was absolute because the Vestals could never speak freely, and the people could never see the full truth. Through these festivals, the power of the elites became intertwined with the sacred. To be present was to validate the system. To leave it unchecked was to threaten Rome itself. And to the girls who were trained and initiated, the experience was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Even history remembers some Vestals who were punished. Under this system, their names whispered in fragments, the ones accused of impurity, the ones who failed rituals, the ones who were buried in the living tomb. Their stories reveal the dangerous balance of public honor and private control. One wrong glance, one failure to obey, could turn a symbol into a victim. The festivals, the processions, the public smiles, they were only one layer. The real power existed behind closed doors, in shadowed halls, and in the gaze of the ruling class. And the city never saw it. The people only saw the beauty, the devotion, the pageantry. But inside, the Vestals knew the truth. The elites were watching. They knew that every movement, every word, every bow was scrutinized. They understood that their lives were not their own. They were living symbols of Rome's strength and reminders of the cost of power. This is how the highest priests and the rulers of Rome maintained their control. Public festivals of joy and worship, private rituals that demonstrated obedience and fear. A system that elevated some girls to near-divine status while stripping them of freedom. The use of ritual and ceremony to legitimize power, and the lesson was clear. In Rome, sacred and human power were inseparable. Those who watched commanded. Those who obeyed survived. Those who failed disappeared. The next chapter will reveal the lifestyle of these elites, their luxury, banquets, and secret influence, how they used power not just in ceremonies, but in daily life. Rome glittered in gold, marble, and firelight. The streets were alive with merchants, soldiers, and citizens celebrating the empire. But behind the grandeur of the city lived another world, one the common people rarely saw. The elite of Rome had wealth beyond imagination. They lived in sprawling houses with frescoed walls, polished floors, and gardens filled with flowers and fountains. They dined on rich foods, roasted meats, exotic fruits, honey, and wine that flowed freely like water. Slaves attended to every need, carrying water, lighting lamps, or brushing their master's hair. Luxury was not just comfort. It was a tool, a symbol, a way to show who held power. Their grooming was meticulous. Men wore jewelry and fine fabrics. Women painted their faces, plaited their hair with gold threads, and adorned themselves with pearls. Every detail of appearance was a display, a public reminder that they were above ordinary life. And the Vestals, trained to be symbols of purity, were part of this performance. They moved through these spaces silently, their white robes shining against marble floors, their faces serene but alert. The elite's power went beyond wealth and luxury. It was hidden in influence over politics, over religion, over the lives of every citizen. They could rise or fall with a single decree, a whispered rumor, or the approval of the Pontifex Maximus, and the Vestals were a tool of that power. Through them, the elites displayed control over the divine. Through them, they commanded obedience and reinforced their authority. Some individuals became legends, rising from obscurity to power because of their cunning, their charm, or their ruthlessness. One senator, for example, moved carefully through ceremonies, watching the Vestals, learning how to gain favor with the Pontifex. He attended banquets, gave gifts, and showed piety, all while keeping a keen eye on rivals. Soon he rose to the consulship, proof that influence could be both subtle and absolute. But just as easily, someone could fall. A wrong word, a failed ceremony, or the loss of favor with the right priest could erase a lifetime of privilege. The afterlife was another tool of control. The elite believed in the gods and feared the wrath of the divine. Stories circulated that the gods would punish those who defied sacred law, that the Vestals could curse with their prayers, that impurity could bring disaster. By linking fear, devotion, and luxury, the system created a cycle that few dared to challenge. The banquets were legendary. Gold bowls, exotic wines, and endless courses displayed wealth. Yet behind the laughter and feasting, there were lessons in power. Guests watched carefully, who bowed first, who spoke out of turn, who showed fear. Every gesture was noted. Every movement was proof of loyalty or weakness. The Vestals were sometimes present, silent and observant. Their beauty and serenity reminded the elite that purity and obedience could be molded, commanded, and displayed. They were living proof that Rome could control life itself, that sacred duty could be a spectacle for those in power. This lifestyle was intoxicating, and it hid a dangerous truth. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. The more the elites flaunted wealth and influence, the more dependent the city became on their control. The more sacred the Vestals appeared, the more unquestioned their obedience became. Rome's elite were masters of symbols. Gold and marble, feasts and ceremonies, purity and fear, all were tools to maintain dominance. Their luxury was not indulgence, it was strategy. Every meal, every robe, every ritual was a piece in the system of power. Yet, for all their wealth and authority, they were not immortal. A single rumor, a failed ritual, a misjudged move could destroy them. Power was like fire, bright, beautiful, but dangerous and fragile. The Vestals were central to this system. Their presence, their obedience, their purity, all reinforced the hierarchy. They reminded the elite that they could command life and death, ritual and devotion, fear and reverence. And they reminded the city that power was sacred, untouchable, and absolute. The next chapter will reveal the corruption, rumors, and decline of these powerful figures, how even the most untouchable could fall, and how history remembers them. Even the most powerful are never truly safe. Rome's elite knew this. Their gold, their ceremonies, and their control over the Vestals could not protect them from one thing: time and human error. Rumors began to spread. A whispered accusation of impurity, a story of greed, a claim that the pontifex had overstepped the law. The people who once cheered began to murmur. And in Rome, whispers could destroy reputations faster than swords. The corruption of the system was subtle but relentless. Those in power grew used to bending rules, taking favors, and ignoring limits. The Vestals' obedience became a tool for political gain. Senators and generals sought their blessings, knowing a Vestal's favor could sway public opinion. Yet behind closed doors, the sacred duty of the girls was twisted into leverage, intimidation, and spectacle. Even minor mistakes were amplified. A Vestal failing to maintain her ritual duties could be blamed for crop failures, plagues, or military losses. The pontifex used these events to consolidate his power, reinforcing fear. And the elite used fear to reinforce their own dominance. Some elite figures, once untouchable, fell hard. One famous example, the last Vestal known to be punished severely, was blamed for impurity during a time of famine. Though evidence was weak, tradition and superstition overrode reason. She was confined to the underground chamber, her voice gagged, her life sealed away. Even those who once dined with senators and generals could vanish if the system deemed it necessary. The cycle of power and fear continued for centuries. Generals who had commanded legions fell from grace. Priests who had manipulated rituals lost influence. The city itself began to see cracks in the system. As the empire grew, as populations shifted, as new rulers took power, the once sacred authority of the Vestals and the pontifex began to falter. Later cultures viewed these events differently. Some admired the Vestals' discipline and the grandeur of the ceremonies. Others saw cruelty, control, and exploitation. Roman citizens and historians began to question the fairness of the system. And the stories of fear, punishment, and obedience became warnings. Tales of what absolute power could do to human lives. The decline of the elite was inevitable. The same fear and reverence that upheld them eventually fueled gossip and suspicion. Some emperors abolished or reduced the power of the pontifex. Some Vestals were released from service early. Some traditions were quietly ended. And the stories of the underground chambers, the sacred punishments, and the rituals became cautionary tales. Yet the impact remained. Even as the empire changed, the lessons of control, obedience, and fear persisted. The Vestals who survived carried scars, mental, emotional, and symbolic, for the rest of their lives. The elites who had wielded power found that no system lasts forever. The last iconic figure of this era, the final pontifex who wielded unchecked authority over the Vestals, serves as a reminder. He had the wealth, the rituals, and the fear of the people. But even he could not stop history from moving forward. The system he had perfected eventually crumbled, leaving only stories, ruins, and echoes of the sacred flame. Rome's glory had blinded many. Its ceremonies had dazzled the people. Its elite had mastered the art of appearing divine. But corruption, abuse, and the weight of human lives could not be hidden forever. And so, as the city changed, the stories of the Vestals and the elite became more than history. They became lessons. Lessons in power, control, obedience, and fear. Lessons in how privilege can turn sacred duty into cruelty. Lessons in how even gods can be used as tools for human ambition. The next chapter will ask the hardest questions: morality, responsibility, and the human cost of absolute power. It will return to the girl we met at the very beginning, standing in the temple, and ask what her story tells us about corruption and control. Then, it will call you to witness and reflect. Remember her? The girl from the first chapter, barely 10 years old, standing barefoot on the marble floor of the temple. Her hair braided, her skin scented with oil and incense, her eyes wide with fear. She had been chosen to serve Vesta. Her life was no longer her own. She had endured training, isolation, ritual, and punishment. She had seen the eyes of the pontifex and the elite, felt the weight of their judgment, and carried the knowledge that her obedience meant life, and that failure could mean death. But now, centuries later, we look back and ask, what does her story mean for us? What does it teach about power, corruption, and human cost? Rome built an empire on faith, fear, and ritual. The Vestals were symbols, untouchable, divine, yet completely controlled. The elites who ruled over them were both powerful and fragile. Their lives were full of gold, luxury, and privilege, and yet they could fall as easily as they rose, undone by rumor, fear, or history itself. We see a system designed to make power appear sacred, a system where obedience was required, where fear enforced discipline, where ritual masked control. It worked because the people believed. It worked because the girls could not speak. It worked because gold, ceremony, and the gods were used to maintain authority. But here's the truth. This is not just a story of ancient Rome. This is how elite corruption works everywhere. Power convinces people that cruelty is sacred. Privilege convinces people that obedience is honor. Fear convinces people to stay silent. And when systems are built on fear, they leave scars that last generations. The girl, the Vestal Virgin, lived through a life that was both celebrated and destroyed. She survived, perhaps, but she was never the same. Her innocence, her childhood, her voice, all were claimed by the empire. Her story reminds us that the cost of power is rarely seen, but it is always real. We ask ourselves moral questions. Can obedience ever justify cruelty? Can ritual ever excuse control? Can faith ever outweigh human cost? History does not give easy answers, but we can see patterns. We can see systems that reward privilege, silence victims, and hide brutality behind gold and ceremony. And we can recognize them today. Remember her standing in that chamber barefoot and trembling, the sacred flame flickering before her. Remember the smell of oil, the echo of chants, the presence of the pontifex. Remember that her life, like the lives of countless others, was controlled in the name of gods, of tradition, and of power. And ask yourself, what do we do when we see systems like this? Do we stand by silently, awed by the ritual? Or do we speak, question, and demand accountability? The Vestal story is a mirror. It reflects the ways power can be used, misused, and hidden. It reminds us that privilege can create both beauty and horror. And it reminds us that the cost of silence is always real. History is full of names we can barely remember. The girl, the pontifex, the senators, their actions shaped lives and empires. We now know the truth of their world, the human cost behind the grandeur. And knowing is the first step toward change. So now it is your turn. Think of the girl in the temple. Think of the fires, the oils, the gold, the chants, the fear. Think of the lives shaped, the innocence taken, the obedience demanded, and ask yourself, were they victims or believers? Were they tools of power or prisoners of it? What would you have done if you were standing there, barefoot and alone? History may not answer, but you can comment below, victims or believers. Subscribe, share. Click the next video, and remember that the story of Rome is more than gold and marble. It is the story of human lives, power, and the cost of control.